Hey there, Dango Stu here. Today's video is about changing the sump oil in a 4-stroke outboard and is proudly sponsored by marineengine.com. Now, changing the sump oil on an outboard, or any motor for that matter, isn't rocket science. But when I did the video on servicing an outboard, that was a 2-stroke motor, and there's a few things that obviously a 2-stroke doesn't have, and one of them is sump oil. In that video, I promised I'd do a little addendum to cover 4 strokes, and that's what today's video is about. Because my boat, the Green Machine's out of the water at the moment getting some other work done, now's a great time for me to change the oil in it. And the outboard on this boat is a 2003 Honda BF40. Used outboard oil is pretty nasty stuff, so it's one of the few jobs I actually always use gloves for. The very first thing I'm going to do is warm the engine up to get the oil a bit thinner to drain it, but also to run a bit of engine flush through it. Engine flush is pretty much like diesel essentially, but with a few additives from my understanding. And it's just about getting some of the old residue and slime and whatever out from under the valve cover, all that kind of thing. So I'm going to run this for about 5 minutes and then we'll switch the motor off and we'll drain the oil. Cowlings work different on all outboards, but generally there's just a couple of clips front and back, sometimes just on the back. Engine flush gets poured into the top of the valve cover on this one, same as when you're refilling the oil. So you're essentially just adding it to the existing oil, the old oil. I'm only putting about 100 mils in because there's a relatively small oil capacity in these outboards, only 2 litres. Now the oil's warm and the engine flush has had a chance to do its job, we'll drain all the old oil out. The location of the drain plug's different from outboard to outboard, but I'll show you where it is on this Honda. On the Honda it's behind this little cover here, so we'll need a flathead to take this cover off, and then there's the sump plug itself behind that. Once the cover's off, you can see the sump plugs up in here, which we're going to take off with a 12mm spanner. Before I do that though, I'm going to take the cover, it was like this, and just rest it here, which means that the oil will pour into our pan more easily rather than just running down the leg. I let this outboard sit for a little while after I was running it, just let the oil settle down from the rocket cover and come back into the sump. On the sump plug here, you can see there's a little aluminium washer, so I'm going to replace that with a new one. This is the original Honda washer. This one's just from a generic Auto Parts sump plug washer kit, and it's close enough to do the job. With sump plugs, I treat them a little bit like spark plugs with a crush washer. They're not holding anything together, so they don't need a lot of force, but by the same token you don't want it so loose that it just vibrates out again. So once it's snug, I really probably just give it a little 1/16 of a turn, maybe even less, just to make sure that it's got a little bit of tension on it to hold it in. That new aluminium washer will compress very slightly too, which will help hold it in. Alright, now just a little bit of brake cleaner, just to clean up the residue, and we'll put the cover back on. When you change the sump oil, you'll always change the oil filter as well. This oil filter is a little bit recessed, so it's hard to get a good grip on it. So I'm going to use a tool like this, which is sprung loaded, just to grip onto it, and then it's got a 3/8 sort of socket on the end here. There's a million and one different types of oil removal tools, but I've always found this one really good. Alright, that wasn't particularly tight, so nice and easy to get off again. Now I'm just going to stuff a bit of rag underneath the oil filter. Although we've drained the bulk of the oil out of the sump, although the sump's below the oil filter anyway, so it wouldn't matter if it was full, but oil will leak out from the oil filter itself and some of the passages just next to it. Best to get the oil filter off pretty quickly, get it upright, because there's still quite a bit of oil in here now, rather than having it run out. And what little bit did leak out, the rags caught. Now this oil filter was a Quicksilver aftermarket one, which is a good choice. I'm actually not going to use any original Honda parts in this at all. I'd rather just use parts I can get more easily and a bit cheaper, to be honest, but that's just me. Now, although Quicksilver parts aren't OEM, they are still marine parts and a little bit harder to get. I often just use a standard car oil filter. In this case, the Z436 is compatible, and to be honest with you, I think I found Z436 to be compatible with pretty much every 4-stroke around this size that I've ever owned. So you compare size-wise, really what you're looking at is the diameter of the O-ring and the diameter and the thread pitch here for it to fit. And in this case, they're same physical size, same thread pitch, same diameter, everything. Now, oil filters will come with this plastic on the top to stop debris getting inside them. Easiest way to get that off is just to press down in the middle and they pop off really easily. Next thing I need to know is the type of oil and the quantity you need. This particular outboard takes 10W30 and takes about 2 litres. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to use a standard 10W30 automotive oil. We've got a 44 gallon drum of it, so I'm not going to go and buy marine oil. I don't know. I've always run automotive oil in my outboards and I've never had any trouble. What I've also done now is just give this flange a bit of a wipe where the new oil filter is going to be sealing against. The O-ring here that seals around the oil filter is dry at the moment, obviously straight out of the package, so I'm going to get some of the new oil and just wipe a bit onto the O-ring. Don't use any tools to install the new oil filter. You don't want it ridiculously loose, but finger tight's enough. Okay, now what we're going to do is pour 2 litres of oil for this motor into the rocker cover where we put the engine flush to start with. Sometimes it can take a little while for oil to make its way down into the sump, so don't pour it too quickly. Oh, and in case you're wondering, I'll show you here. This pipe here at the bottom of the valve cover is the one that takes the oil back down into the sump. Next thing we need to do is start the motor, because at the moment that oil filter is empty, just got air in it, so we're going to pump oil into the oil filter all through the galleries, then we'll switch it off, let it settle for a while, then we'll check the dipstick to see if our level's right. Once you've switched the motor off and the oil's had a chance to settle back down into the sump, maybe 10 minutes or so, longer the better really, then next thing to do is just check the dipstick, see where the level's actually at. We had a theoretical capacity from the service manual, but things may vary. On the Hondas, dipstick's on the starboard side, so just give it a wipe with a small rag, pop it back in, then when you pull it out, you can see where the oil's up to. In this case, the oil is up to the top of the cross-hatching, so it's pretty much full. Be careful with this style of dipstick too. Sometimes this rubber gets dislodged and moves up and down the dipstick, which will totally throw your reading out at this end. Just something to be aware of. Now, because this video is technically a 4-stroke supplement to the other video I did on servicing an outboard, there are 2 other main things you can check that don't exist on a 2-stroke motor. These are the condition of your timing belt and also the tensioner and the bearing inside the tensioner, and then also the valve clearances under here. I've got separate videos on replacing the timing belt and adjusting the valve clearances, so I'll put links to those in the description. Before we wrap up, there's a couple of last things I'd like to say about an oil change. First one is not everyone likes oil flushes. Some people argue that if a motor has never been flushed, it's got a bit of grime, you can put a flush through, have a big chunk of something come out, get stuck in a valve spring, whatever, and end up causing a problem. And that can happen. Personally, I think if you've bought an outboard, you can kind of flush it every change and you'll never get yourself in that situation, which is why I like using them. The other thing is to do with oil level. If your oil light comes on, it's not because your oil's getting low, it's because you don't have oil pressure. You essentially have no oil. Switch the motor off unless you're offshore and you have to pump, back to shore or whatever. But it's not like a fuel warning light. It's not saying to you, your fuel's low, get to a service station. It's saying, I no longer have enough oil to have oil pressure, and that's bad. So take that warning very seriously if your outboard gives you your oil light. The other is that if you overfill oil, not so much with outboards because of the orientation, but the problem we have is that the oil level comes so high in the sump that the crankshaft starts hitting the surface of the oil. It can then whip it into a bit of a foam, put lots of air in it, which can also cause you to lose oil pressure. So overfill can be really bad as well. The last thing about oil level is if you run the motor, fill the oil filter, etc., let it settle, you check the level is too low, add some more oil, let it sit for a minute or so for that oil to make its way down to the sump, and then you can just check it again straight away. You don't need to run the motor again because the oil filter is already full. Then you're really just topping it up to get to the right level, then you're good to go. All right, well that's about it, wraps this up. Pretty simple video in some ways, but I thought it was worth going through for the sake of completeness. All right, well take care, I'll catch you next week. See ya.